The morning mist clung to the Mississippi River like a shroud as Major General Ulysses Simpson Grant stood on the deck of his headquarters boat, studying the imposing bluffs of Vicksburg through his field glasses. It was March 1863, and the fortress city loomed before him like an ancient castle, its cannon bristling from earthworks that seemed to grow from the very cliffs themselves. The fate of a nation would hang in the balance of what happened here. Vicksburg perched on the eastern bank of the Mississippi River like a hawk watching its prey, commanding a sweeping view of the waterway that had become the lifeline of the Confederacy. Confederate President Jefferson Davis had declared it the nail that holds the South to halves together, and he was not wrong. From this strategic point, 200 feet above the muddy waters, Confederate artillery could sink any Union vessel attempting to pass, effectively cutting the United States in half. The city's natural defenses were formidable beyond imagination. The Mississippi River curved sharply at Vicksburg, forcing any approaching vessel to slow down and present itself as a sitting target to the Confederate guns above. To the north and east, a maze of bayous, swamps, and tributaries created a watery labyrinth that had swallowed previous Union attempts at assault. The Yazoo River Delta stretched for miles, a mosquito-infested wilderness that had claimed more Union soldiers to disease than to Confederate bullets. Lieutenant General John Clifford Pemberton, the Confederate commander defending Vicksburg, had spent months fortifying his position. Born in Philadelphia, but loyal to his adopted South, Pemberton understood that holding Vicksburg meant controlling the flow of supplies from the Trans-Mississippi Department. Cotton, cattle, and grain from Texas, Arkansas, and Louisiana moved through this corridor to feed the Confederate war machine. Lose Vicksburg, and the Confederacy would be strangled by its own geography. Grant had already learned the hard way that Vicksburg would not fall to conventional assault. His first attempt, the overland campaign through Mississippi, had ended in humiliation when Confederate cavalry under Major General Earl Van Dorn destroyed his supply depot at Holly Springs in December 1862. The raid had sent Grant's army retreating back to Tennessee like whipped dogs, their supplies scattered across the Mississippi countryside. The failure at Holly Springs had taught Grant a bitter lesson about the nature of warfare in the Mississippi Valley. Traditional military doctrine demanded secure supply lines and predictable battlefields. But here in the heart of the Confederacy, such luxuries did not exist. The Confederate cavalry moved like ghosts through the countryside, striking Union supply trains and disappearing into the wilderness before retaliation could arrive. As Grant contemplated the challenge before him, he knew that capturing Vicksburg would require more than military genius. It would demand a complete reimagining of how war could be fought. The city sat like a cork in the bottle of Confederate power, and removing that cork would require methods that no American general had ever attempted. The spring of 1863 would test not only Grant's tactical abilities, but his willingness to gamble everything on a strategy so audacious that even his own subordinates questioned his sanity. The War Council that convened in Grant's cramped headquarters tent on April 16, 1863, buzzed with tension as the general outlined his revolutionary plan. Major General William Tecumseh Sherman, Grant's most trusted lieutenant, listened with growing alarm as his commander proposed what seemed like military suicide. The plan was breathtaking in its audacity. Grant would march his army down the western bank of the Mississippi River, cross below Vicksburg, and attack the fortress city from the undefended rear. Admiral David Dixon Porter, commander of the Union gunboat fleet, studied the map spread across Grant's field table with the practiced eye of a sailor who had spent months probing Vicksburg's defenses. The naval officer's weathered face reflected years of frustration as he pointed to the treacherous bend in the river where Confederate artillery commanded every approach. General, Porter said slowly, running those guns will cost us half the fleet. Sherman's objections came in rapid succession, each one rooted in military orthodoxy that had guided American warfare since the Revolution. Without secure supply lines, the army would starve. Without reliable communication with the North, reinforcements could not arrive. Without control of the river, retreat would be impossible if the campaign failed. Grant listened patiently to each concern, then delivered his response with quiet confidence. The risk of doing nothing is greater than the risk of this plan. The strategy that Grant proposed violated every principle taught at West Point Military Academy. He would abandon his supply lines entirely, ordering his army to live off the land as they marched through enemy territory. This concept, known as foraging, had been attempted by smaller cavalry units, but never by an entire army deep in hostile territory. The gamble was staggering. If the Mississippi countryside could not feed 43,000 Union soldiers, they would starve hundreds of miles from safety. According to historical analysis from the Smithsonian Institution's comprehensive study of Civil War logistics, Grant's decision represented a fundamental shift in American military thinking. The traditional European model of warfare, with its emphasis on established supply lines and predictable battles, simply could not function in the vast wilderness of the American frontier. Grant's plan required perfect coordination between Army and Navy. Porter's gunboats would run past Vicksburg's batteries under cover of darkness, accepting whatever losses were necessary to establish Union control of the river below the city. Meanwhile, Grant's army would march south through Louisiana's swamplands, avoiding Confederate detection until they could cross the Mississippi at Grand Gulf, or another suitable point downstream. The risks were astronomical. If Porter's fleet suffered too many casualties running the gauntlet, Grant's army would be stranded on the wrong side of the river. If Confederate forces discovered the Union march before the river crossing, they could attack while Grant's forces were divided and vulnerable. If the Mississippi countryside had been stripped bare by previous armies, the Union soldiers would face starvation in enemy territory. Major General John Alexander McClernand, the political general who commanded one of Grant's corps, voiced the concerns that many officers shared privately. McClernand had connections in Washington that made his opinions dangerous to ignore, and he made no secret of his belief that Grant's plan bordered on madness. The Illinois politician-turned-general argued that such risks were unnecessary, when conventional siege warfare could eventually reduce Vicksburg's defenses. But Grant understood what his critics did not. Time was the Confederacy's greatest ally. Every day that Vicksburg remained in Confederate hands allowed supplies to flow across the Mississippi River to sustain the rebellion. Every week of delay gave Confederate engineers more time to strengthen their fortifications. Every month of inaction allowed Confederate diplomats in Europe to argue that the Union cause was failing, potentially bringing foreign intervention that could change the war's outcome forever. The night of April 16, 1863, arrived with the kind of oppressive humidity that made soldiers' uniforms cling to their skin like wet canvas. Admiral Porter's fleet of gunboats and transport vessels gathered in the darkness above Vicksburg, their crews making final preparations for what many believed would be a suicide mission. The silence was broken only by the gentle lapping of water against hulls, and the nervous whispers of sailors checking their equipment one last time. Porter had assembled 12 vessels for the desperate run past Vicksburg's batteries, 7 gunboats, 3 Army transports, and 2 steamers loaded with supplies that Grant's army would need once they crossed the Mississippi River below the city. Each ship had been prepared for battle with cotton bales stacked along their sides to absorb Confederate shot, and their smokestacks wrapped in wet hay to muffle the sound of their engines. At 11:30 that night, the lead gunboat Benton began its descent toward the blazing mouth of hell that awaited below. Porter stood on the pilot house, his experienced eyes scanning the dark water ahead for the telltale signs of Confederate observation posts. The plan called for complete silence until discovery became inevitable, then maximum speed to minimize exposure to enemy fire. The first Confederate sentry spotted the Union fleet when they were still 2 miles above the city. A rocket burst high above the river, bathing the water in brilliant red light that transformed the peaceful Mississippi into a stage for impending slaughter. Within minutes, every Confederate battery from Vicksburg to Warrenton opened fire in a thunderous cannonade that shook the earth for miles around. The scene that unfolded resembled something from Danny's vision of hell. Confederate artillery crews had prepared for months for this moment, stockpiling ammunition and rehearsing their firing sequences until they could load and fire their cannons in complete darkness. The river blazed with the continuous flash of muzzle fire as shells screamed through the night air, sending geysers of water skyward when they missed their targets and showering the Union vessels with deadly splinters when they found their marked dock captain. Henry Walk, commanding the gunboat Carondelet, later described the experience in his official report. The rebel batteries opened upon us with a fury that seemed to shake the very foundations of the earth. Shot and shell fell around us like hailstones in a thunderstorm, and it seemed impossible that any vessel could survive such concentrated fire. The transport Henry Clay, loaded with supplies desperately needed by Grant's army, took a direct hit. from a Confederate shell that penetrated her hull below the waterline. As the vessel began to list dangerously to port, her crew fought frantically to transfer essential supplies to other ships, while Confederate gunners continued their merciless bombardment. The captain ordered the ship abandoned when it became clear that she could not be saved, and the Henry Clay settled into the muddy waters of the Mississippi River, with a cargo that Grant's soldiers would sorely miss in the days ahead. But Porter's gamble was succeeding beyond his most optimistic projections. The Confederate gunners, firing blindly in the darkness and fast-moving targets, were achieving far fewer hits than their abundant ammunition expenditure suggested. Most of the Union vessels suffered damage, but only the Henry Clay was lost completely. By dawn on April 17th, 11 of Porter's 12 ships had successfully run the gauntlet and were anchored safely below Vicksburg, their crews exhausted but triumphant. The psychological impact of Porter's successful run proved as important as the tactical victory. Confederate civilians who had watched the bombardment from Vicksburg streets realized for the first time that their impregnable fortress was not as invulnerable as they had believed. If Union gunboats could pass their batteries, what else might the Yankees accomplish? Meanwhile, Grant's soldiers, who had witnessed the spectacular fireworks display from their camps across the river in Louisiana, gained new confidence in their commander's audacious strategy. Grant's army began their march through the Louisiana swamplands on April 20th, 1863, plunging into a landscape that seemed designed by nature to test human endurance. The column of 43,000 soldiers stretched for nearly 20 miles. As they wound their way along narrow roads that were barely elevated above the surrounding wetlands, Spanish moss hung from ancient cypress trees like funeral shrouds, and the air buzzed with clouds of mosquitoes that tormented man and beast alike. Major General James Birdseye McPherson commanded the lead corps as they navigated through terrain that challenged every assumption about military movement. Traditional Army doctrine called for wide, well-maintained roads that could accommodate artillery and supply wagons. But here in the Mississippi River bottoms, such luxuries did not exist. The soldiers were forced to march single file along raised causeways that had been built by French colonists more than a century earlier, their boots squelching through mud that never seemed to dry. The logistical challenges of moving such a large force through hostile territory without supply lines would have defeated a less determined commander. Grant had ordered his men to carry only essential equipment, abandoning the massive baggage trains that typically accompanied Civil War armies. Each soldier carried 40 rounds of ammunition, 3 days' rations, and little else. The rest would have to be obtained from the countryside through foraging, a polite term for organized requisition from Confederate civilians. Colonel James Harrison Wilson, Grant's chief topographical engineer, rode ahead of the main column with a team of scouts and local guides, many of them escaped slaves who knew the hidden paths through the bayou country. These African-American guides proved invaluable, leading the Union Army along routes that Confederate cavalry could not easily discover or block. Their knowledge of the terrain often meant the difference between successful passage and potentially catastrophic delay. The march revealed the complexity of loyalties in Civil War Louisiana. While some plantation owners fled at the first sign of Union soldiers, others remained to protect their property, engaging in careful negotiations with Union officers about what could be requisitioned and what must be left untouched. The interactions were tense but generally civilized, as both sides understood that excessive violence would serve no one's interests. Private Wilbur Fisk of the 14th Vermont Infantry recorded his impressions of the march in letters home that would later be published in Vermont newspapers. "The country through which we are passing is unlike anything I have ever seen," Fisk wrote. "Great plantations stretch as far as the eye can see, worked by slaves who watch our passage with expressions I cannot read. Some seem hopeful, others fearful, and many simply curious about these blue-coated strangers marching through their world." Grant himself rode among his troops during the most difficult portions of the march, his presence serving to maintain morale when conditions became nearly unbearable. The general's willingness to share the hardships of common soldiers had earned him fierce loyalty throughout his army, and that loyalty would be tested to its limits during the grueling weeks ahead. By April 29th, Grant's army had reached Hard Times Landing, a steamboat port 30 miles below Vicksburg, where they hoped to cross the Mississippi River. A reconnaissance revealed that Confederate forces, under Brigadier General John Stevens Bowen, had fortified Grand Gulf, the most suitable crossing point, with artillery that could devastate any Union attempt to establish a beachhead. Grant would have to find another way across the river, and time was running short. The march through Louisiana had achieved its primary objective of moving Grant's army below Vicksburg without detection by major Confederate forces, but it had also revealed the enormous challenges that lay ahead. The soldiers were already showing signs of fatigue from their journey through the swamplands, and their supplies were running dangerously low. Grant needed to get his army across the Mississippi River quickly, or his audacious plan might collapse before it could truly begin. Part 5. Crossing the River of Destiny. Pre-dawn darkness of April 30th, 1863, concealed one of the most daring river crossings in military history, as Grant's army prepared to leap across the Mississippi River at Bruinsburg, Mississippi. The location had been chosen after Confederate defenses at Grand Gulf proved formidable to assault directly. Instead, Grant would cross at a lightly defended ferry landing 30 miles below Vicksburg, gambling that speed and surprise could overcome the inherent vulnerability of an amphibious assault. Admiral Porter's gunboats had spent the previous day bombarding the Confederate fortifications at Grand Gulf in a thunderous duel that lasted more than 5 hours. The naval attack was partly genuine and partly deception, designed to convince Confederate commanders that the main Union assault would come at that heavily fortified position. While Confederate attention focused on Grand Gulf, Grant quietly moved his army further downstream to the undefended crossing point. The river crossing began at dawn with the transport steamers, making repeated trips between the Louisiana and Mississippi shores, each loaded with soldiers who knew they were committing themselves to victory or death. There would be no retreat. Once they set foot on Confederate soil, Porter's fleet could not spare the vessels needed to evacuate the entire army if the campaign failed. Grant had literally burned his bridges, forcing his soldiers to fight with the desperation of men who had no choice but to win. Brigadier General John Eugene Smith's brigade was among the first to establish a foothold on the Mississippi shore, their blue uniforms standing out starkly against the red clay bluffs. As they scrambled up from the landing, the soldiers moved with the urgency of men who understood their vulnerability, quickly establishing a defensive perimeter while their comrades continued to ferry across the mile-wide river behind them. Local Confederate resistance proved later than expected, consisting mainly of scattered militia units who melted away into the countryside rather than face a full Union corps in pitched battle. The lack of organized opposition suggested that Confederate intelligence had failed to detect Grant's movement, giving the Union Army precious hours to consolidate their position before enemy reinforcements could arrive. Major General John Alexander McClernand's 13th Corps crossed first, followed by McPherson's 17th Corps, with Sherman's 15th Corps bringing up the rear. The crossing continued throughout May 1st and 2nd, with Union engineers working frantically to improve the primitive roads leading inland from Bruinsburg. The bottleneck at the ferry landing created dangerous congestion, but Confederate forces seemed strangely absent from the area. The absence of strong Confederate resistance puzzled Grant's subordinates, but the commanding general understood the strategic situation better than his critics realized. Confederate Lieutenant General John Clifford Pemberton faced an impossible dilemma. His orders from Richmond required him to hold Vicksburg at all costs, but defending the city meant concentrating his forces behind its fortifications. Any attempt to meet Grant in open battle would expose Vicksburg to capture while his army was away. Meanwhile, Confederate General Joseph Eggleston Johnston, commanding the Department of the West from his headquarters in Tennessee, had been sending contradictory orders to Pemberton. Johnston wanted the Vicksburg garrison to abandon the city and unite with other Confederate forces for a coordinated attack on Grant's army, but President Jefferson Davis had made it clear that losing Vicksburg was unacceptable under any circumstances. The confusion in Confederate command structure worked to Grant's advantage as his army established itself on Mississippi soil. By May 3rd, more than 20,000 Union soldiers had crossed the river and were beginning their advance inland. The soldiers foraged aggressively through the rich farming country of southwestern Mississippi, their empty supply wagons gradually filling with confiscated corn, livestock, and other provisions needed to sustain the campaign. Private Theodore Upson of the 100th Indiana Infantry wrote in his diary about the abundance they discovered in the Mississippi countryside. "We have found more food in 2 days than our commissary could have supplied in a week. The rebels have lived well while our boys have made do with hardtack and salt pork. Now it is our turn to feast on their hospitality." Grant's successful crossing of the Mississippi River represented more than a tactical victory. It marked the beginning of a new phase in American warfare. For the first time in the conflict, a major Union army was operating completely independent of its supply lines, living off the land in the heart of Confederate territory. The psychological impact on both sides was profound, as soldiers and civilians alike realized that the rules of war were being rewritten before their eyes. Grant's army erupted across the Mississippi countryside like a blue thunderstorm, moving with a speed and ferocity that stunned Confederate defenders, who had expected traditional siege warfare. On May 12, 1863, the Union advance struck the Confederate garrison at Raymond with such unexpected force that Brigadier General John Gregg's brigade was overwhelmed before they could establish proper defensive positions. The Battle of Raymond lasted only 4 hours, but it demonstrated that Grant's army had lost none of its fighting edge. During the arduous march through Louisiana, the victory at Raymond revealed Grant's true strategic genius. While Confederate commanders expected him to march directly north toward Vicksburg, Grant instead pivoted east toward Jackson, the Mississippi state capital. By capturing Jackson, he would cut the railroad that supplied Pemberton's army in Vicksburg and prevent Confederate General Joseph Eggleston Johnston from uniting his forces with the Vicksburg garrison. Major General William Tecumseh Sherman's 15th Corps led the advance on Jackson, their march taking them through some of the richest plantation country in Mississippi. The soldiers marveled at the wealth they encountered: grand mansions, surrounded by thousands of acres of cotton fields worked by enslaved laborers, who watched the Union Army's passage with expressions ranging from hope to fear to curiosity. The approach to Jackson on May 14th revealed the growing demoralization of Confederate forces in Mississippi. General Johnston had managed to assemble only about 6,000 troops to defend the state capital, far too few to resist Sherman's entire corps. The Confederate commander faced the same impossible choice that plagued Pemberton in Vicksburg: fight and risk destruction, or retreat and abandon vital territory to the enemy. Johnston chose retreat, evacuating Jackson after only token resistance that lasted less than 3 hours. Sherman's soldiers occupied the Mississippi State Capitol building by mid-afternoon, raising the stars and stripes over the seat of Confederate government in Mississippi. The symbolism was powerful. For the first time since the war began, Union forces controlled a Confederate state capital in the Deep South. The capture of Jackson provided Grant with more than symbolic victory. Union soldiers seized tons of Confederate supplies that had been intended for Pemberton's army in Vicksburg, including artillery ammunition, medical supplies, and food that Grant's own men needed desperately. More importantly, they destroyed the railroad infrastructure that connected Vicksburg to the rest of the Confederacy, effectively isolating Pemberton's garrison from outside support. According to military historians at the American battlefield Trust, Grant's campaign between the Mississippi River crossing and the capture of Jackson represents one of the most brilliant examples of maneuver warfare in American military history. In just 18 days, Grant's army had marched over 180 miles, fought and won 5 separate battles, and completely disrupted Confederate defensive plans for the entire region. But Grant understood that his greatest challenge still lay ahead. Pemberton's army remained intact in Vicksburg, protected by some of the strongest fortifications on the North American continent. The Confederate commander had used Grant's absence to strengthen his defenses further, creating a maze of trenches, artillery positions, and obstacles that would test Union resolve to its limits. The race against time was becoming critical. Every day that Grant remained in the Mississippi interior increased the risk that Confederate reinforcements might arrive to trap his army between multiple enemy forces. Johnston was already attempting to rebuild his scattered command, and rumors suggested that Confederate forces from as far away as Arkansas and Alabama were marching toward Mississippi. Grant's soldiers sensed the urgency as they prepared to turn west from Jackson toward their ultimate objective. They had proven that Union armies could operate successfully in the heart of Confederate territory, but taking Vicksburg would require different skills than those needed for rapid maneuver warfare. The soldiers, who had marched so brilliantly through the Mississippi countryside, would now have to transform themselves into siege warriors, prepared for the grinding warfare of trench and fortification that awaited them in the hills above the Great River. The morning of May 19, 1863, dawned with the kind of oppressive heat that would characterize the next 47 days. As Grant's army settled into siege positions around Vicksburg, the commanding general stood on the bluffs overlooking the Mississippi River, watching Porter's gunboats maintain their relentless bombardment of the Confederate fortifications. The thunder of naval artillery had become as constant as the summer heat, a reminder that this siege would test American resolve like nothing before in the nation's history. Grant's initial attempts to take Vicksburg by direct assault had failed with bloody repulse on May 19th and 22nd, costing the Union Army over 3,000 casualties. The Confederate fortifications proved even stronger than intelligence had suggested, with interlocking fields of fire that made frontal assault tantamount to suicide. Pemberton's defenders, now numbering about 30,000 soldiers and civilians, had used their months of preparation wisely, creating defensive positions that could withstand anything short of complete starvation. The siege that followed became a contest of endurance that would reshape American understanding of modern warfare. Grant's army, now numbering over 70,000 men with the arrival of reinforcements, completely encircled Vicksburg from the river to the inland approaches. Union engineers began digging their own network of trenches and artillery positions, creating a double ring of fortifications that prevented any Confederate attempt to break out, while protecting Union soldiers from enemy fire. The civilian population of Vicksburg faced horrors that no American city had previously experienced. Confederate authorities had failed to stockpile adequate food supplies before the siege began, assuming that the city's defenses would prevent any prolonged Union investment. As weeks passed, the city's residents were reduced to eating horses, dogs, and even rats to survive. Many families dug caves into the hillsides to escape the constant Union bombardment, creating an underground city beneath the original settlement. Marion Loughborough, a Confederate civilian who endured the siege, documented the experience in a diary that would later be published as My Cave Life in Vicksburg. Her entries reveal the psychological toll of constant bombardment and starvation. The roar of the guns has become so constant that we hardly notice it anymore. But the hunger grows worse each day. The children cry for food that we cannot provide, and we wonder how much longer human beings can endure such suffering. The military implications of Vicksburg's fall extended far beyond the immediate tactical situation. Control of the Mississippi River would allow Union forces to move supplies and reinforcements freely throughout the Western Theater, while Confederate forces would be permanently divided between the Trans-Mississippi Department and the rest of the Confederacy. The economic impact would be equally devastating, as Confederate access to the agricultural and industrial resources of Texas, Arkansas, and Louisiana would be severed. Grant's siege tactics evolved throughout the summer as Union engineers employed increasingly sophisticated methods to reduce the Confederate fortifications. Mining operations began in late June, with Pennsylvania coal miners tunneling beneath Confederate strongpoints to plant explosive charges. The most ambitious mine was dug beneath the 3rd Louisiana Redan, where Union engineers planned to detonate 2,200 pounds of black powder to create a breach in the Confederate lines. The mine explosion on June 25th created a crater 30 feet deep and 40 feet wide, but the assault that followed failed when Confederate defenders rallied to contain the breach. The failure demonstrated that even the most advanced siege techniques could not guarantee success against determined defenders fighting from prepared positions. By early July, both armies were reaching the limits of human endurance. Confederate soldiers were deserting in increasing numbers as their families starved in the besieged city, while Union troops suffered from disease and exhaustion caused by weeks of living in trenches. During the Mississippi summer, Grant knew that time was running short. Confederate General Johnston was assembling a relief force that might arrive before Vicksburg's defenses collapsed. On July 3, 1863, as news arrived that Lee's invasion of Pennsylvania had been repulsed at Gettysburg, Pemberton finally acknowledged that further resistance was futile. The Confederate commander requested terms for surrender, beginning negotiations that would end on Independence Day with the capitulation of Vicksburg and its entire garrison. The surrender ceremony on July 4th marked more than the end of a single campaign. It represented the moment when Union victory in the Civil War became inevitable. President Abraham Lincoln captured the significance perfectly when he declared that the Father of Waters again goes unvexed to the sea. The Mississippi River was once again under United States control, and the Confederacy had been cut in half permanently. Grant's Vicksburg campaign had accomplished more than capturing a strategic city. It had demonstrated that Union armies could operate successfully deep in Confederate territory, living off the land and fighting with a mobility that Confederate forces could not match. The psychological impact on both sides was profound, as Southerners realized that their heartland was no longer safe from Union invasion, while Northerners gained confidence that the war could be won through aggressive offensive action. The lessons learned at Vicksburg would influence American military doctrine for generations. Grant's willingness to abandon traditional supply lines and fight with unprecedented mobility pointed toward the kind of warfare that would characterize later conflicts. The siege itself demonstrated both the potential and the limitations of modern military technology, showing how defensive positions could withstand enormous punishment, while revealing the ultimate futility of resistance against superior numbers and resources. Most importantly, the fall of Vicksburg marked the beginning of the end for the Confederate States of America. With the Mississippi River under Union control and Lee's army weakened by its defeat at Gettysburg, the Confederacy could no longer hope for military victory. The only questions remaining were how long the war would continue and how much additional suffering would be required before peace could be restored to the divided nation. Grant's triumph at Vicksburg had indeed reshaped the course of American history, proving that bold leadership and innovative tactics could overcome seemingly impossible obstacles. The young nation that emerged from the Civil War would be fundamentally different from the one that had entered it, united not just by geography, but by the shared experience of having survived its greatest trial. The Mississippi River flowed freely once again, carrying with it the hopes and dreams of a reunited America.